First of all, I wish to thank all the funding agencies here, in particular FWF, who funded my postdoc through the Erwin Schrödinger Fellowship, and the current position that I have here in Twente, that is a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellowship, together with all the other funding agencies that provided financial and also computational resources. So the works I present today are the results of collaborations with several people in Twente, where I am now, in Udine, in Vienna, and also in Rome. And all these people are knowledge, so I don't mention them in each part of the presentation, but they have really contributed in each of the topics I will discuss. Okay, so the presentation is structured in this way. First, I will give an example of why convection in porous media is relevant. And then I will examine a problem that is a multi-scale problem. So we will see that this problem can be split into several sub-problems at different scale, from the macro scale to the Darcy-scale to the pore-scale. And finally, we will derive some conclusions. So the first is the motivation. So why do we want to know what happens in a porous medium with convective flows? So one possible reason in which this phenomenon is important is the formation of sea ice. So when the sea ice forms, the problem can be modeled in this way. We have a layer of ice that is in contact on one side with the cold atmosphere, and then below we have a seawater. So when the ice starts forming, it means that some crystals of ice, so just water, solidify. And the salt that is present in the seawater is expelled. So we have a concentration gradient in terms of salt, but we have also a temperature gradient because the top layer here is cooled down, exposed to the atmosphere, whereas the bottom layer is, in a sense, hotter than the. So we have temperature and concentration gradients that induce density gradients, and then that induce convective motions. So this is an example of convection in porous media, where the medium is the porous icy matrix. The other examples are, for instance, the contamination of groundwater flows. So what I will refer explicitly to in this talk is the carbon capture and storage. So the idea, you're probably familiar with this problem. The idea is to store carbon dioxide in underground geological formations. These formations can be idealized in this way. We have two layers that are impermeable, so low permeability rocks, these gray layers here. And the space between this layer is filled with a porous matrix, so rocks. And then we inject, at some point here, carbon dioxide. And we inject it in with the hope that it will stay there for as long as possible. So this porous matrix is not empty, but is filled with, in the interstitial space, with brine that is highly salted water. So the density of brine is order of 1,000 kilograms per cubic meter, and the density of carbon dioxide is much smaller, say 500 kilograms per cubic meter. So as a result, the carbon dioxide after injection will start to stay on top of brine and spread horizontally below this cap rock. So this process is beautifully illustrated by this experiment by Chris McMinn and co-workers. And what we see here is that there is an additional effect. So at the interface between the currents of carbon dioxide and brine, the two fluids can mix and a heavier solution forms. And this solution is beneficial because it enhances further the mixing of these two fluids. And then carbon dioxide can deposit at the bottom, in this case, at the bottom of this experiment, and eventually stay trapped there stably. So why is this important? Because if there is a fracture in this cap rock layer here, then carbon dioxide, being lighter than the surrounding fluid, can eventually escape and go to the upper layers or to the atmosphere. So this is something we don't want. But this process is a complicated process. And the fact that it's complicated also by the fact that it's a multiscale process. So you see that the extension of the reservoir can be of the order of thousands of meters. Then the interfacial structures that form when the dissolution takes place can be of the order of tens of meters. And finally, if we further zoom in at the scale of the pores, the relevant length scale can be of the order of centimeters or even less. So there is a huge scale separation, and it's simply impossible to tackle this problem with just one approach. So what I'm trying to discuss in this talk is, okay, we need a multi-scale approach, and we need to split the problem in these 3 different scales at least, and then to combine the results, because these scales are not independent from each other, but they have to talk to each other indeed. Okay, so the first part is to analyze the dynamics of the system at the reservoir scale. So this is done in the frame of the multi-phase gravity currents. So when we talk about the reservoir scale, we talk indeed about this part of the problem. So what do we want to know here? We would like to know some macroscopic quantities and global quantities. For instance, how far will the current of carbon dioxide spread horizontally? If it spreads a lot, that's a problem, because it is more likely that it will find a fracture in the low permeability layer and escape. Other quantities of relevance are, for instance, how much will it take if we inject 1 million tons of carbon dioxide today to dissolve completely in our formation? So all these questions are related also to the permeability and to the, let's say, to the properties of the formation. So is the formation anisotropic? Is it heterogeneous? Are there confining layers? So are there, for instance, impermeable layers that are not horizontal? Can the porous matrix react chemically and change its morphology? So these are all effects that can be included and should be taken into account when trying to predict the evolution of the injected current of carbon dioxide. Okay, so these are some time frames that represent the evolution of the system. So initially we have just carbon dioxide on the left and brine on the right. And the volume of carbon dioxide will eventually migrate on top and spread horizontally. And during the process of spreading, these instabilities form and enhance the mixing. So what happens at some point is that the carbon dioxide that mixes with the brine forms this heavier mixture, which deposits at the bottom. And then we observe that there is a formation of this heavy mixture of carbon dioxide plus brine. So the mixture, which is forms a current that is here indicated by this red line. And this current grows in time. And eventually the current, so this region here, can grow and touch the current of carbon dioxide. So at this point, we have one portion of the carbon dioxide that is not in contact with the current, and another portion, so this part blue is not in contact, and then we have another portion, this part red, that is in contact. And here it's very difficult to dissolve carbon dioxide, whereas here it is still possible. Here it's difficult because this region is now saturated with the solute. So this problem can be modeled as a problem. So this phenomenon can be modeled as a gravity current, but we have to take into account that we have two currents and these ones interact with each other. Okay, so if we want to solve the problem at the full Darcy scale, then these are the governing equations. So essentially, we have we assume that the flow is incompressible, it's controlled by the Darcy law, and that the solute transport is controlled by this conservation equation. So this would be the approach to solve the problem at the Darcy scale, so to resolve these plumes. However, if the size of our reservoir is large, this might be prohibitive in computational terms. So we choose a different approach, which is the approach proposed by Wien and co-workers, in which they develop a model for gravity currents. And essentially, they define two quantities, h, which is the height of the current of carbon dioxide as a function of the position in space and time. So it's a one-dimensional model. And then we have hm, which is the current of the mixture of carbon dioxide plus brine. So without going into the details, what matters here is that these two currents, so are just two fluids in a porous medium that are driven by buoyancy, can interact. So here is an example with some analog fluids, and this model has been resolved. And what you see here is the predictions of the model, the blue and the light blue lines, compared to the experiment. So the model in principle works, but the question is, okay, how do these two currents communicate? So how do we know that one volume of carbon dioxide is going from current 1 to the current 2? So this is the key parameter that we are looking for. So, and this is a kind of dissolution rate. So it's the amount of carbon dioxide that is dissolved per unit of surface area and time, and that goes from the current blue here to the current light blue. Okay, so this is now the idea, and this is the key parameter we need to determine. But how do we determine this? Well, this is the result of what happens at the interfacial dynamics. So here, so we need to resolve the flow at this scale, so at the Darcy-scale, and then we will be able to predict what is the dissolution rate to use this parameter into the equations of the large-scale model equations. Okay, so just for a second, now we'll focus on the dynamics here. So already you see that we do some simplifications, because this interface that in this figure is inclined, we represent it as an horizontal interface. This is a simplification, of course, but it helps to analyze more in detail the physics. So looking at the scale, then we can solve the problem we're using the Darcy equations. So now we have a two-dimensional or a three-dimensional problem. And the governing parameter here is the Rayleigh-Darcy number. So you may be familiar with this number. The Rayleigh-Darcy number, I will just say Rayleigh number here and after, contains all the information about the porous medium, so the permeability and the porosity, about the fluid, depth, density difference, viscosity, and diffusivity, and about the domain also, so gravity and domain height. So this is the configuration, and we assume that the concentration is constant at top with no penetration boundary condition, and the concentration gradient is 0 at the bottom, so there is no flux at the bottom. Okay, so again, at the end of the day, we want to know how much carbon dioxide we can dissolve in our domain. So what do we compute is the flux at the top boundary here. So this flux is evolving as a function of time, and this is what we see in this movie here. So note that the movie first is in log scale. The time is reported in log scale because all these phases are different. And then we have three panels here. One panel is the entire simulation. This panel on the top right represents this green rectangle here. And then we have a close-up view of the top wall that is represented here. Okay, so this is all the same simulation, but just different points of view. Okay, so what we observe is that at the top wall, small instabilities, these plume-like instabilities form. And the dynamics here is really rich because we observe continuously the formation of these instabilities, which eventually move and merge with larger instabilities and form these structures that we observe here in the larger picture. So these structures are much more persistent in time and also in space. So you see that they are stick to one position. And the domain keeps dissolving carbon dioxide until at some point it is saturated. So when this happens, there is a sharp drop in the flux. So you see the transition from this point to this point. So I can play the movie again. So we can focus on this. So the fingers grow, and essentially nothing remarkable happened in this regime, in the sense that everything is constant in terms of dissolution. So the fingers, these large structures are formed, and they just keep growing. But then when they reach the bottom, the domain starts to be saturated. And eventually, when the top part of the domain is also saturated, the flux suddenly drops. And this part is called shutdown of convection. So now if we go back to our initial problem formulation, this is what we need to know. This value during which the flux is constant, nearly constant. So this is called a constant flux regime. And this is essentially what happens when we have a current of carbon dioxide that interacts with the current of brine before the lower region is saturated. Okay, so this is the idea. This is how the Darcy simulations work. So how can we use this? Well, for instance, we can consider a porous medium that is anisotropic. So this is a relevant example, for instance, for sedimentary rocks. So these rocks are originated from the deposition of several layers over the years. So they have properties in one direction that are remarkably different than the same property in the other direction. So for instance, the permeability. This is, of course, one possibility. We make also in this case some simplifications, some assumptions. So first of all, sometimes it's not simple to split the effect of anisotropy and the effect of heterogeneity. So we usually have media that are non-homogeneous and also anisotropic. So we assume for simplicity in this case that the media are homogeneous. And another assumption we do is that we have anisotropic media with a permeability tensor that is aligned with our reference frame. So this means that we can find a suitable reference frame in our system so that the permeability tensor is diagonal. Okay, so with these assumptions, we do the simulations again. And what we obtained in the case of isotropic media is this. And now we do the same simulation in case of anisotropic media, in which we vary the permeability just in horizontal direction, while the permeability in vertical direction remains constant. And we find this. So we observe that if we increase the permeability in horizontal direction, then the flux increases. This is meaningful, of course, because if we increase the permeability, the flow can flow easier in that direction. And due to continuity, it will recall more fluid and transport vertically more fluid. Putting the data together, then we end up with one equation that tells what is the dissolution rate as a function of the permeability ratio, that is the parameter that we use to characterize the medium. And so finally, we can plug in this value into our model and see what happens. So, for instance, one quantity that is relevant to know is the position of this point here, xn, which is defined the nose of the current. So as I have anticipated, this defines the horizontal extension of the current. And the wider it is, and the more likely is that the current, when migrating, will find a fracture in the low permeability layer. So we perform we run the model, the large scale model, with the values we found for the flux here. And we find different behaviors as a function of the permeability ratio. So this is an example of how this multi-scale approach can be applied. Another quantity of relevance is the volume, or the fraction of volume dissolved as a function of time. So again, if we inject 1,000 tons of carbon dioxide today, how much will it take for this volume to be completely dissolved, or to be dissolved at the rate of 10, 20, or 30%? So this is the kind of information we can obtain. Okay, so this concludes the first part. And now we go from the reservoir scale to the Darcy-scale. So in this case, we will talk first about the simulations, and then about experiments and finite size effects. So concerning the simulations, we've seen that already this is a possible setup in which the governing parameter is the Rayleigh-Darcy number, defined here. And one question that we wonder now is this. So what happens if we increase the Rayleigh-Darcy number? So we can interpret the Rayleigh number in this way. We can tell, okay, if all the properties of the medium and fluid are kept constant, the Rayleigh number may be seen as the domain height, okay, because here we have h. So it's a dimensionless domain height. So if we increase the Rayleigh number, it means that we are considering domains that are taller and taller. So what do we expect to happen? Well, this is the dynamics, and essentially, if we imagine that the domain is just twice deeper than this means that it will take twice the time for the fluid to reach the bottom. And then essentially this point, so the time at which the shutdown occurs, will occur later. But this dynamics will not be affected by the fact that the Rayleigh is doubled. It's just the second part of the evolution, so the shutdown. Okay, so this is exactly the study that was done by Slim. And what she observed is that indeed, if the Rayleigh number is sufficiently large, when you increase the Rayleigh number, so these curves refer to different values of Rayleigh number, you obtain that during the constant flux is always the same, but what differs is the time at which the shutdown occurs. So this is one observation. Okay, now, as you see, this system is a transient system. This is sometimes not convenient to study numerically, in the sense that first we would like to have systems that are steady state so that it's easier to derive statistics. And therefore, we used to study not only this configuration, but this configuration. So this is called the Rayleigh-Bénard, and it's a classical configuration studied also in turbulence. And that's also an advantage because we have a lot of literature about this in free fluids. So it's essentially a box that is heated from below and cooled from above. And if you see, there are of course similarities. So you can just imagine that in this time, this part of the domain is equivalent to just half of our Rayleigh-Bénard system. So using this system has some advantages, so that we can derive some exact energy budgets. And I won't speak more about this, but essentially these two systems are correlated, and studying one or the other may lead to the same conclusions. So here and after, I will refer to this configuration mainly, so to the Rayleigh-Bénard configuration. So there have been performed a lot of simulations and studies in the 2D convection, and here I indicate some references. And the main findings suggest that the flow structure is organized in this way. There is a very thin boundary layer here. Then there is an intermediate region in which we observe the formation of small plumes. These plumes eventually merge into these larger structures in the core of the flow that are called megaplumes. This is what is observed in 2D. So the dynamics is similar in 3D. However, the problem was less explored because it's essentially tremendously expensive in computational terms. So it works to be explored because having a three-dimensional domain rather than a 2D one gives you an additional degree of freedom, and the flow behavior can be very different. So starting from this, we perform a number of simulations in the 3D simulations in this case. And well, the configuration is what is shown here. So essentially, again, it's a box that is heated from below and cooled from above. And we resolve the Darcy equation and a transport equation for the scalar quantity here. Again, we have just one governing parameter, that is the Rayleigh number. Okay, so this is how the flow looks like in this case. So this is a vertical slice, and is not very different to what we have observed in the 2D case. So you still have the boundary layer, which you don't see because it's really tiny. You have protoplumes here, and then you have large scale and persistent structures here in the middle. However, if we look at the near wall dynamics, so in this part, the situation is quite different. So in this case, we don't observe just the presence of protoplumes of these tiny cells, but we also have these large scale cells. So it's what you see in this movie is the presence of these bright filamentary structures that are stable in space and also in time. Let's say are statistically stable. And within these structures, we observe the formation and the destruction of plumes. So if we look closer, this is what we see. Okay, so it's very dynamic, but at the same time, there is a persistency in the large-scale motions. So this large-scale motion, these supercells, are something that we didn't observe in 2D because, of course, of the geometry. Okay, so the first question we had is, okay, where do these supercells come from? So we use an approach that has already been used in turbulence to answer this question. And that's also one of the advantages of using this configuration, because we can leverage decades of knowledge in the field of turbulent convection. So we take a slice of the temperature field near the wall here, and we take a slice of the temperature field in the center. Okay, so what you see here, the contours are just iso temperature contours. Okay, now what we suspect is, of course, that there is a correlation between the flow in the center and the flow near the wall. And what we do then is, okay, we take the average wave number, so the wave number that is representative of the structures in the center of the channel, and we filter out all the structures that are smaller than this wave number here. So essentially, we just filter out all the small scale structures near the wall. And what is left is this. So the line is the same as in the center, and it's superimposed to the temperature field filtered near the wall. So as you can see here, there is a strong correlation between these two quantities that suggests that essentially the large scale structures, so the supercells that we observe near the wall, are nothing but the footprint of the megaplumes that dominate the flow in the center of the channel. So this is the first result, and this is remarkable because it's something we cannot observe with just the 2D simulations. Then another question we wonder is what happens if we just confine the domain in one of the dimensions? So we go from one 3-dimensional configuration to an ideally 2-dimensional. So numerically, we can do this. And of course, in the experiments, it's not trivial to confine the domain, and we will see this later. So if we start confining the domain in one direction and confining even more, is there a point in which this confinement will we observe a transition from a 3D flow to the 2D flow? This is the first question we had in mind. So to answer this question, we perform some simulations with different aspect ratio, but same Rayleigh number. So essentially here, I just report the domain that is this thin 8 times. Here I report the domain 4 times so that it's easy to visualize. And so what we observe is that, of course, the confinement has a strong effect on the flow. So while in this case, the flow is the same as we used to observe in large domains, as soon as the flow is confined in one direction, then the cells are more and more constrained, and finally they are very stable. So we go from a situation in which there is a very dynamic behavior like this to a configuration that is very stable. So this has an effect not only on the physics of the cell, but also on the transport properties, because you can imagine that the transport properties of this situation are very different than this one. Okay, so again, at the end of the day, we would like to be able to predict what is the dissolution rate in such a system. So for the simulations we have analyzed, we obtained this result. So this is not something we obtained, but this is something that is known now in the literature. So that the flux across this top wall is constant. Or in other terms, the Chervon number, which is the flux multiplied by Rayleigh, scales with Rayleigh. This is what we expect to find. Okay, so experiments in porous media, however, reported something different. Reported that the Chervon was not scaling linearly with the Rayleigh number, but was scaling less than linearly. That means that the flux is not constant. Okay. Then there were experiments in Hele-Shaw cells that reported the same behavior, so that the flux, again, was not constant, but was a function of the Rayleigh number. And finally, there are simulations, Darcy simulations, including many effects. So not as simple as we did, but for instance, considering that there is an effect of the concentration on the viscosity, or that the density profile is not linear, it's not monotonic. And what they concluded is that, okay, whatever effect you consider, if you use a Darcy model, you must find this relationship. So this means that if these people doing experiments didn't find this relationship, it's because they have some effects that are not present in the Darcy model. And this brings to the last part of the talk, that is, see what are these effects and what is their role. Okay, so we start analyzing the experiments in Hele-Shaw flows. So you know that Hele-Shaw cell is essentially consists of two parallel plates divided by a narrow gap. And if the Reynolds number is sufficiently small, then the flow within this gap is parabolic. And then we can derive exactly what is an expression for the velocity profile. And we can also write a correlation between a laminar Poisson flow and a Darcy flow, provided that the suitable value for the permeability of the cell is taken. So this is the Hele-Shaw analogy for Darcy flow in porous media, and this is very well known. Okay, but again, here we are talking about a dimensional transition. So we pretend with a three-dimensional system that is a Hele-Shaw to represent a two-dimensional domain. So when does this work? Is there a threshold above which this value, this result is close to the 3D behavior or close to the 2D behavior? So to answer this question, Latelier and co-workers derived a set of equations. Essentially, they said, okay, we can take the Navier-Stokes equation and take the gap average of these equations and solve the problem in this way. And what they obtain is something remarkable. So first, they observe that the flow is not just controlled by the Rayleigh number, but there is an additional parameter that is defined as anisotropy ratio that takes into account the relative importance of the gap thickness and the height of the cell, or in other terms, the permeability, the square root of the permeability over the height. So what they find is that we may have three different scenarios. So the first scenario is this, in which we have the combination of these parameters, so epsilon square Rayleigh, that tends to 0. So this is, of course, is ideal, because in experiments we will never have this, we will never achieve this condition. And this is representative of the Darcy simulations. A second, well, we must also say that in this case, if we look at the cell, that is this, and we look at the cell from the side, plume will look like this. So there is a very, very flat concentration profile across the gap thickness. So everything is essentially uniform across the gap. Okay, so what if we increase a little bit now the thickness? Well, we might be in one of the other two cases. So we might be in this case, where we have still just one finger, but we have a strong concentration gradient across the gap. Or we might be even in the full three-dimensional condition in which we have more than a finger. So in this case, it's fully 3D. So these results provide a possible explanation of why we observe the difference between the Darcy scaling that is predicted theoretically and the results that are sublinear, so in the sense of the flux, that are obtained in the Hele-Shaw or in the Hele-Shaw case. So we did some experiments to check this. So we perform Hele-Shaw experiments using a cell, and this cell is designed in a way that we can control independently Rayleigh and epsilon. So we can change both the thickness and also the height of the domain that we consider. And we measure the flux in this configuration. And what we find is that exactly in correspondence of the value that was predicted theoretically, there is a sharp transition in the regime. So the flux drops dramatically in correspondence of this point. So of course, here we never reach this configuration, the Darcy configuration, because that would mean to have an infinitely thin cell. But we are likely below this level. So we are in the Hele-Shaw regime. Okay, so this is important because it provides an explanation to the different findings observed experimentally and theoretically. And this brings to the last part, that is a pore-scale modeling and dispersion. So indeed, we didn't explain why there was a difference between the porous media experiments, that means experiments with the glass beads, and the theoretical analysis predicting that the Cherbourg number should scale linearly with Rayleigh. Okay, so when we talk about real porous media, we have two more ingredients that we didn't introduce yet. So one is that we have an additional length scale. So in this case, we have an additional length scale that is represented by the ratio between the length scale of the flow structures and the pore space. So of course, in the Darcy simulations, we don't see this problem because in a Darcy scale, you assume that the flow structures are much bigger than any relevant pore element. But this is something that should be considered if we do pore-scale simulations. And another effect is the presence of dispersion. So you know that if you take a tube filled with a porous medium and you put the dye in this tube, and then you apply a uniform velocity profile across this medium, the dye will not be simply advected, but it will be dispersed. So it will be stretched and dispersed over a longitudinal and transverse direction. So this phenomenon is very well known, and this has been also modeled in different ways, also in the frame of a Darcy convection. So this formulation consists essentially of not assuming that the diffusion coefficient is a coefficient, but replacing this with a dispersion tensor. But the problem here is that the dispersion tensor should be appropriately validated. And so to achieve this goal, we perform experiments and simulations at the pore scale. Okay, so I will try to be fast here because I see that my time is almost over. So we perform experiments and simulations in the same configuration. We use now a Rayleigh-Taylor configuration. So two different fluids of different density that are fully miscible. Experiments are performed in glass beads and simulations are performed in this setup, so pore-scale, pore-resolved simulations. So experiments and simulations are designed to represent the same flow properties in the sense that the porosity is matched, that the Schmidt number is similar, and that there is the same behavior of the dependency with respect to the concentration of solute. So this is a sketch of the experiments. Essentially, we have two fluids that are initially divided by a gate, and then I open the gate and the mixing can start. And this is what I can record from the front of this cell. Simulations are performed instead using a porous media that at the moment is two-dimensional with an hexagonal pattern. And the flow evolves in this way. So the methodology consists of a finite difference and the immersed boundary methods. Okay, so first we compare the results to validate the simulations. And we compare the results in terms of the mixing length. So that how this region, so the extension of this region grows in time. And we observe that overall there is a good agreement, especially for the late times. For the early times, this does not happen, but this is because it is very sensitive to the initial condition, which can be hardly controlled in the experiments. Okay, and then we would like to be able to predict what is the mixing rate. So the flux, in this case, we don't define the flux, but we define this quantity chi, which is related to the flux and is the mean scalar dissipation. So here in this system, we can identify a first regime that is controlled by diffusion. And this is the initial part when we have the fluid 1 and the fluid 2 separated by a flat interface. And with some simple theoretical arguments, we can derive the exact relation between the scalar dissipation and the time, which is this dashed line here. The second part is controlled by convection. So this is more complicated because fingers are extremely nonlinear. So, but also in this case, we can predict something. For instance, we can say with analytical arguments, what will be the maximum value of the scalar dissipation? So what would be the maximum mixing expected at some time? And also, we observe that it is not really constant, but it decreases as a function of time. So we provide a more sophisticated model that is based on some considerations on the interface. And this model gives a better description of why this is decreasing. Finally, there is a shutdown. What does shutdown mean? It means that the fingers have reached the sides of our domain. The domain is saturated, and it's harder and harder for the two fluids to mix because locally the concentration gradients are really, really small. Okay, so what matters in this case is not the diameter of the bead, but what matters is the size of the domain, because that is h, so the size of the domain, that sets the time required for the fingers to reach the walls. So if we rescale everything with a temporal scale that takes into account the size of the domain h, then we observe again a very nice self-similar behavior. Okay, so this is just to provide you with the idea of the multi-scale modeling that we have in mind and how we are approaching this problem. So I hope I convince you that convection in porous media is a multi-scale and also a multi-phase process, and that we need to use experiments, simulations, and theory, and combine all these approaches to get more information about what is going on in our system, because just one single method would not be sufficient. So we did, as a community, we did a lot in the recent years. So there was an incredible development of experimental and numerical techniques, but we are still far from having a complete description of this problem because the parameter space is just huge. So with this, I concluded. So most of the things I've shown here are available in these two preprints that you'll find on arXiv. I really thank you for inviting and for your attention, and I would be happy to take any question.